So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out for our session. That previous talk was interesting to me because I actually grew up on a dairy farm in Virginia and fed a lot of calves as a young person, and I see that a lot has changed in the 40 years since I was feeding milk replacer to calves, so that's good to hear. I'm actually going to switch gears quite dramatically, actually, and I should introduce myself. I'm Sarita Fry. I'm a professor in the Department of Natural Resources at UNH, and an ecologist and soil microbiologist by training. So although I started up on a dairy farm feeding calves, and I guess the influence is that I ended up becoming a soil scientist. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to move into the soil today, or at least for my talk. And I was tasked with talking a little bit about research that I've been doing for the past 15 years or so to look at the effects of environmental change on soils. And I'm going to focus today on climate change and the impacts that might be having on our soils in New England. And then at the end of the talk, I'll come back and talk a little bit about this effect, perhaps at the global scale. So let's see if I can make this thing work. Okay. So I guess I should say that I'm going to talk about this experiment that I show in the background here, which is an experiment we've been doing, like I said, for 15 years or more at the Harvard Forest, which is an experimental forest in central Massachusetts, where we've been warming the soil over time to simulate climate warming and look at the effects on the ecosystem and in particular on the soils. But before I get into that detail and talk a little bit more about the experiment, I want to just give a little bit of background for context. And the first piece of background that I want to talk about is the role of soils in storing carbon. And I'm sure for any of you that are working in the agricultural or forest sector, you know that soils are a really important storehouse of carbon, typically in the form of soil organic matter. And this organic matter is really important for soil fertility, water holding capacity, nutrient supply to plants, and so on. But it's also, it turns out, an important food source for all of the soil organisms, the microorganisms that live in soil. And sort of one of the inadvertent effects of organic matter decomposition is that microbes produce carbon dioxide and other gases as byproducts, and those go into the atmosphere and can affect the composition of our atmosphere. So I just wanted to point out that soils globally contain about 2 times as much carbon than all that's contained in the atmosphere and all vegetation combined. So this includes tropical rainforests and so on. And again, the decomposition of organic material that's in soil is a natural process. It's occurred for millennia. But with climate warming and other environmental changes, we have the potential of stimulating that decomposition and actually adding more carbon dioxide and other trace gases to the atmosphere than we have done or have seen historically. And so that's what I want to focus on today. I also just wanted to give a little bit of background for climate change in the region so that we can put this in a regional context. And here is a figure for New Hampshire in terms of expected atmospheric temperatures over the next century, or I guess I should say going from 1960 to 2100. So in New Hampshire, we've seen about an increase of 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit in mean annual temperature since about 1970, and the projections through the end of this century are for further increases on the order of 4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And this increase in temperature that's occurring will come with associated consequences. So things like spring arriving earlier, summer lengthening. The number of summer days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit is expected to triple. We're expecting more precipitation as rain, less as snow. We're already starting to see that. And we're expecting increased frequency of summer and fall droughts. And all of this together basically means that the climate of New Hampshire and New England generally is migrating south. And the prediction is shown here on this map, such that by the end of the century, the climate of New England is expected to be somewhere around current-day Virginia or North Carolina. I grew up in Virginia, and I don't know about you, the winters are okay, but the summers can be brutally hot. So Having grown up in Virginia, I kind of know what we're in for. So anyway, So coming back to our experiment, again, this is an experiment at Harvard Forest, an experimental forest. So I am talking about forest soils, but I think that what I have to say is relevant to agricultural soils as well, and really soils globally. But a little bit more about our specific experiment. This picture is taken in late winter, early spring, at the beginning of snow melt. We're actually looking through the canopy from a walk-up tower. And so you're looking over our research plots. And what you're seeing in the background here are these square areas that actually are our heated plots. These are patches of forest that have heating cables underneath them. So this is basically a heating blanket under the forest that's simulating climate warming. And we've been heating these soil patches anywhere from 10 to 25 years continuously. And what else can I say about that? All of these patches have similar vegetation, similar tree species, similar soils, and really what's being altered is the soil temperature. So what I'm going to show you then are just a couple of slides of results, and I'm only going to focus on the amount of carbon that's coming out of the soil, but again, this represents a loss of soil organic matter with any sort of attendant effects on soil fertility as well, and I'm happy to talk about that during the question session if that's of interest. But what I just want to show here is the amount of carbon that comes out of the soil when the soil is warmed continuously. And this is showing, these bars are showing the difference between a heated plot and a control plot. And so if you have a bar above the 0 line, that means that more carbon is coming out of the soil as carbon dioxide relative to the ambient soil, the control soil next to it. And if it's close to the 0 line, that means that the heated soils are behaving similarly to the control soils. So when we look at the first 10 years of warming, we see that initially we have about a 20 to 30% stimulation of organic matter decomposition or carbon loss from the soil. But you can see that as we move toward that 10-year mark, this response starts to go away, and the soils in the heated plots tend to come back to their baseline level. And indeed, if we look at that for another 5 years, so 15 years out, we see that this response really flattens out such that the heated soils are no longer releasing carbon dioxide at a greater rate than the ambient soils or the control soils around them. And so our initial conclusion from these results was that maybe this effect of climate warming on soils isn't going to be as bad as initially predicted, and maybe it's an ephemeral or short-term effect. However, Jerry Melillo, who started this experiment, a scientist at Woods Hole, had the foresight to keep this going for, it's still running, and we're on the 26th year. And if we look out through 25 years, we see something very different, and we have a different conclusion now, which is that the loss of organic matter from soil due to warming is cyclic, and there are periods of large losses, and there are periods of stasis or small losses, but the net effect is that we're losing significant organic matter from the soil over time. And so if we look at this in terms of the soil organic matter that's being lost, we see that we're losing about 30% of the carbon in that top layer, that organic horizon, where the tree litter, the leaves that fall in the autumn are decomposing. So we lose about 30% of that material very rapidly within the first 5 years of warming. If we look out over the entire 25 years of data that we have so far, and we look over the entire soil profile, which at this site is about 20 to 30 inches or so, we're losing about 17% of the carbon across that profile. And again, I don't have time to talk about what that means for soil fertility and soil health, but I'm happy to entertain questions related to that if there are any. What I do want to do is try and put that into a broader perspective, and also want to point out that while we're focused on one forest in one place in New England, there are over 100 experiments like this now globally. And I'll come back to some global data in the next slide, but what I did want to say is that there is particular concern in places like the Arctic, which are warming much more rapidly even than here in New England. And where the permafrost is starting to melt. And so this was a story actually on, this is a picture from a story that aired on National Public Radio last week, and it's a very fascinating story. So here's a link if you'd like to go and find that and listen to it. But basically this story is about permafrost, the large, vast amounts of carbon that are stored in permafrost soils in the Arctic all around the globe. There are meters and meters of organic matter that has been in a deep freeze basically for millennia, and that is now thawing and becoming exposed to the activities of microorganisms. And there is this concern that very large quantities of greenhouse gases will be released into the atmosphere in the coming decades and exacerbating our already climate warming that we're already experiencing. Well, so what does that mean then based on sort of the data that we've been collecting and data that our colleagues have been collecting at some of these other sites? So this is the last slide I'm going to show, and this is just to, again, try and put all of this into some sort of perspective. So a group of us that have these soil warming sites collected as much of the data as we could. We were able to collect data from about 40 or so sites around the world, and those are highlighted here on the map. And without going into a lot of detail, I'll just say that the calculations that we came up with were that over the next, over this century, we expect or we predict a large loss of carbon from soils on the order of 55 petagrams. And last night I was thinking, well, how can I sort of put that into terms that someone besides an ecosystem ecologist can relate to? And so I went online and I looked at the number of cars on the planet, and I did some back of the envelope calculations. And the amount of carbon that we're anticipating could be released from soils globally as a result of climate warming is the same as if you took all cars off of the road that are currently on the road on the planet. There's about 1 billion cars, it turns out, on the planet. If we took them all off the road for 7 years, that's the amount of carbon that we will potentially be releasing from soils due to climate warming. So that's just a cautionary tale. I'm happy to talk in more detail if you're interested about mitigating ways to mitigate this, but I'm not going to do that sort of formally in my talk. I'm going to end there, and I'm going to just thank the many graduate students and postdocs and collaborators that have been involved in this work over the last decade or so. So thank you. Yes.
Over this 26-year period, do you know if there have been drastic changes in the microbial composition of these soils, or?
Yes, thank you for that question. That's really a great question. I'm going to actually try to go back to that. So this slide, yeah, so what we have seen is that there is a shift in the organisms that are living in the soil and that are responsible for the decomposition of organic matter, and we think that's why we see this cyclic pattern. So we think that we're seeing a shift in the microbial community towards one that's more able to decompose, more hard to decompose, more recalcitrant materials. And what we think is that initially they used up sort of the yummy stuff that was in the soil, and that's when their activity declined, and then the community shifted to organisms that are sort of have the ability to break down harder to decompose things, and that's why we then see this spike again in carbon loss over time.
So Rita, is this a pattern that we see in regions that are already warm? I mean, you mentioned Virginia, North Carolina, for example. Do we have decomposition of organic matter at a faster rate in soils in warmer areas than cooler ones?
Yeah, so this is the only experiment. So the average duration of this type of experiment is 5 years. And so this is the longest running experiment, and we don't have enough experiments to know whether this pattern holds in other locations. Certainly, this early response is kind of universal. If you heat a soil, more carbon comes out, more organic matter decomposes, because the microbes speed up their activity when they're warmer, and they just have a tendency to decompose things faster. So that happens early on. What we don't know is whether this cyclic pattern is a universal phenomenon, if you will.
Fascinating. It's something you see in composting. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
I think this will might be drawing it, but so what is happening down in Virginia where they already have these conditions that we're going to have in X amount of years? Is their soil composition different down there?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, so certainly there are, if you go to the tropics, for example, where it's very warm and moist, you don't actually even have a forest floor to begin with, right? Because the microbes are keeping up with all of that material that falls on the floor. So they're under optimal conditions all the time, so they have very high rates of decomposition. Now, what will happen under climate warming with the more stable parts of the organic matter that's in the mineral soil is, again, something that we're not sure about. But for sure, we have different amounts of organic matter in different places depending on the climate conditions in that location, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay.